You are listening to Tall Men on a Bus, written and performed by Brian Nolay. For the fourth day I boarded the number 3 bus at Charles and Pratt Streets, hoping that it would be my last, but certain that I would have a few more days to pay for my negligence. I had come to terms with the fact that I had no one to blame but myself. I had been instructed by my father to keep a good record of maintenance on my vehicle, and as youth are wont to do, had ignored him completely. Careless as I was, it should have come as no surprise when my engine seized up after 40,000 miles without an oil change. With my car now inoperable and myself insolvent, I had no choice but to tow the vehicle to a local technical institute for an instructional, read gratis, repair. As a result, I was now at the mercy of a team of neophyte grease monkeys and dependent upon the Baltimore public transportation system to deliver me to and from work each day. I took a side-facing seat halfway to the rear, leaned my head back on the cold glass window, and scanned the coach to see if there were any familiar faces. It was not that I would have known anyone well enough to rearrange my seating or begin an exchange of pleasantries. I did this only to study the patterns and schedule that might exist on this bus at this hour. If there was a silver lining to my situation, it was the opportunity for people-watching that these excursions afforded me. I am that particular brand of individual who moves through life always taking the role of the observer. Even when I find myself in an act of participation in some venture, I feel as though I am on assignment, always taking more notes than joy in said endeavor. Some people would think such a predilection a curse, but if given a choice, I wouldn't have it any other way. I was not alone. There were others like me, observers, that I had noticed on this very route over the past few days. I only knew this because of an occasional and fleeting breach in the rules. Observers must take care when observing our ilk, for we have the ability to feel the weight of a stare. On occasion, I was forced to visually confront one of my own kind in an act of studying me. I must confess that it thrilled me more than it should to watch their inquisitive eyes dart for the safety of another direction once caught. On this particular afternoon, I recognized no one. Given this unfamiliar cast of characters, I scanned the car, trying to make careful note of today's riders so that I could check for repeat performances on the morrow. The day's commuters were varied, but of little interest. Across from me were 2 young men in oversized jeans who, though seated, were doing their fair share of hipping and hopping to unheard music coursing through their headphones. Toward the back of the bus, a heavy-set businessman in an ill-fitting suit was sitting cross-legged, compulsively folding and refolding his Wall Street Journal as he blotted sweat from his brow. Across and to my right was an elderly woman with a grotesquely exaggerated underbite. To make matters worse, she had set her jaw in a scowl of positively canine proportions as she sat stock-still, clutching her purse in a white-knuckle grip, though no one posed her the least bit of threat. Just behind her sat a fellow whose complexion was a patchwork tapestry of black and white, no doubt the effect of the dermal condition known as vitiligo. Across from him and seated just to my right was a girl of perhaps 7 years of age. That no one in the immediate vicinity fit the bill of guardian for this child struck me as odd. The girl was blessed with a toffee complexion and sapphire blue eyes, suggesting that she was as splendid a blend of black and white as the man across from her was not. She wore her hair in thick dreadlocks that spilled down her shoulders and framed her flawless face. This lone girl was not skilled in the rules, for she had fixed an inquisitive eye in my direction for some time. I stared back at her, briefly, hoping that the blunt acknowledgment of her indiscretion would send her back to the solace of her book. But she stared just a second longer, finally nodding her head as if to signify that she had arrived at the answer to a difficult question. Only then did she turn away without the slightest hint of unease. I wondered what her decision was. Perhaps she had decided that I was the infamous stranger that her mother had warned her about all these years. At St. Paul and North Streets, the 2 young men with headphones shuffled from the coach, barely able to navigate the stairs with their denim crotches binding them at the knee. Here, a new passenger boarded the bus. This rider drew the attention of all the observers, as he was an unusually tall fellow, nearly 7 feet, I would imagine, and as wide as any 2 men. Those who did not see him coming at first quickly took notice when the bus sank under his weight. He ascended the stairs awkwardly, his massive body laboring with each step. It was apparent that the man's size was a tremendous burden, but certainly one that he could do little about. He had to crouch forward to keep from hitting the ceiling, but this did not stop him from clumsily making his way to the very back of the bus. I braced for the impact that his body would make when he most assuredly collapsed into his seat, but to my surprise, he lifted his arm, barely, and grabbed for a strap. There he stood as the bus pulled from the curb, filling me with a gnawing unease at his obvious discomfort. The bus pulled out into traffic, and most of the riders returned to whatever distraction they had chosen, but I felt compelled to watch our newest arrival. Perhaps I was just concerned that the rhythmic sway may topple the fellow in my direction, but to the contrary, the giant was quite stable in his position. In fact, he seemed to not move at all, as if he was part of the bus. I conceded to myself that size must have its advantages, and decided to shift my gaze to other riders of interest. I was studying an attractive woman in her early 20s when the bus came to its next stop. The young lady spoke with an Eastern European accent, and I gathered from the tone of her conversation that she was running a bit late. She was shouldering a diaper bag and an umbrella, and I was quite convinced that she was an off-duty au pair, eager to shed the matronly trappings of her profession before hitting the happy hour circuit. She hung up her phone and moved to the door, and that is when I first saw him. Standing outside of the bus, his face flushed to pale crimson, was a man who stood to a height of 6'9" or 6'10". He boarded the bus, going hand over hand on the railings until he had fully climbed the stairs. With his face further reddened and his breath coming in fits and starts, he worked his way toward the back of the bus. Here I must make an odd confession. I realize that there is not some secret fraternity amongst the inordinately tall, but for whatever reason I assume that this giant and the previous one were somehow connected. As I watched the one colossus approach the other, I awaited the exchange of pleasantries that would inevitably ensue, but it never came. In fact, the one giant took no notice of the other whatsoever. As the second man approached me, I scooted toward the young girl to make room for him, but he passed by unaware of my gesture. He stopped 3/4 toward the back of the bus and remained standing just like the brute before him. With a single-handed purchase on the rail in front of him, he braced his weight against the motion of the bus as it lurched into action. My recent movement toward the dreadlocked girl had drawn her attention, and she fixed her sapphire eyes upon mine without hint of unease. To the contrary, her look was one of understanding. But understanding of what? I turned to the giants, then back to her, and she nodded ever so slightly, as if to say, "Yes, that is odd, isn't it?" I thought to concur with a wink, but then thought better of it. It may have been viewed as far too forward a gesture between a man and a child by my fellow observers. At the following stop, I found myself quite relieved that no mammoth individual boarded the train. I am not sure why. I am not one to discriminate against people for any reason, the least of which would be size, for I myself stand at a height of 6 feet 5 inches. And though I am far from a giant and quite agile for my size, which my former standing as captain of my college volleyball team should attest, I can sympathize with the trials these men face each day in a world engineered for a 5 foot 10 inch man. So why their presence gave me such pause I cannot tell you. It just did. With that being said, imagine my surprise when the door opened at the corner of Loch Raven and Belvedere and another enormous man boarded the train. The sight of this man, all 6 feet 8 or 9 inches of him, sent a cold spasm from my neck down through the very core of my being. Again, this man paid no heed to the other two, and once more opted to stand despite his hulking, awkward frame. It was beyond coincidence, and I don't think I was the only one made to feel uncomfortable. Two unrelated riders stood and exited the bus in such a haste that I can say with a fair measure of certainty that this was not their intended stop. I thought of leaving myself, but I was now so transfixed by the absurdity of this gathering that I could not move a muscle, save for the wrinkled gray one in my skull that ached for some shred of explanation. There must be some connection between these behemoths, I demanded to myself, but what? The chills were now pulsing through my spine, but I could do nothing but try to make sense out of this fluke. Not one of the giants gave the least bit of notice to any one of the others. They each stood in an oafish stillness and utter silence. How absurd, I thought. By and by I came to the realization that it was the very fact that they seemed so oblivious to each other that fueled my suspicion that they were not. Let's take, for example, our vitiligo-afflicted rider. If he should look up from his seat to discover a face mottled in black and white like his own, would he not give the slightest nod of recognition? And if a third party with brindled complexion should happen onto the bus, would the three not at the very least exchange a round of smiles to signify the audacity of such a gathering? I looked to the remaining observers and was surprised to see that they did not seem at all distressed by this odd convergence. All except for one paid no heed whatsoever to the situation that was now holding me hostage. The one exception was the little girl with the sapphire eyes. She was not as uncomfortable as I, but she kept looking from one giant to the other. Then, in a gesture that seemed more symbolic than practical, she buttoned her coat up to the neck. Perhaps she, too, had caught a chill. I felt the brakes of the bus activate, and I turned toward the approaching corner with a mechanical slowness, deliberate as the hour on a fine timepiece. Even though I knew what would be waiting there, I must confess that I still nearly screamed when I saw him towering over the crowd. As the bus came to a halt, the scene played out before me for the fourth time. The hulking man lumbered his way onto the bus while a few people fought their way past as they made for the door. If people were leaving out of fear, I did not notice. I could focus on one thing and one thing only, and that was whether or not this last giant gave notice in any way to the three others on the bus. At length I found myself slipping into an odd despair when the man took his spot in the front of the bus. He too remained standing with a look neither happy nor sad, a look that, just like the others, was completely and utterly emotionless. A new thought took seed in my head and began to grow. I know this will sound positively ludicrous, but perhaps it was the only way I could come to terms with my present circumstances. I now began divining that what was playing out before me was some type of a hoax or publicity stunt. I chuckled to myself with this realization, as preposterous as it may seem, because it was the first thing that made any small shred of sense. How does this proceed, then, I thought, and more importantly, where is the camera? Certainly those responsible will want to have documentation of this most elaborate of shenanigans. From where I sat, I made a visual search of every nook and cranny for signs of a hidden camera, but saw none. I began running scenarios in my head. Will another behemoth board the train at each stop until all normal-sized folks are squeezed out? And if so, to what effect? Is this the work of an artist trying some Christo-like human installment on a city bus? Interesting, but not exactly clever, I thought. Then the most fantastical idea entered my head. Perhaps everyone in this bus is in on the joke, but me. I know this sounds like a ridiculous conceit, but it certainly made the most sense out of my situation. Perhaps I was the one being duped, but by whom? Who would go to such pains to play a practical joke on me, a complete and utter nobody too poor to get his car out of the shop? Still, I felt certain that something was about to happen and that I alone was the target. The chills now increased as I waited for the next step of this operation. I was determined to keep my wits about me no matter what occurred. I would not give them the satisfaction of triumphantly proclaiming how they had caught me on tape acting the fool. Seconds passed like minutes, and minutes like hours, but nothing happened. Block after block we drove, and no more giants boarded. Stop after stop, the four behemoths remained stock still, like monolithic, lifeless stones. My suspicion of an elaborate con began to waver, and of course, without this explanation, I had nothing but fear and confusion. Only a few more blocks to my stop, and this madness would be over, I thought. And I resolved to get a hold of myself and simply wait it out. That's when it started. All at once they came to life. Like the wheels of a locomotive that begin to slowly spin as the steam fills its pistons, each giant began to move. The one closest to the front slowly raised his head until it pressed on the ceiling of the bus, then his body twisted toward the rear. I followed his gaze and discovered that the first brute to board was glancing back at him. The third colossus was also moving, but he attempted no contact with the others. His eyes closed, and with his face drawn into a painful grimace, he reached his second hand to the rail. With both hands locked on in a white-knuckled grip, the man began quivering violently as if enduring some great bout of pain. I looked to the second man to board, the shortest of all the giants, and was quite shocked to discover that he was moving, albeit slowly, in my direction. He did not look at me. He did not look anywhere near me, but I knew that he was coming for me. The empty spot to my right, the very one I had made to accommodate him earlier, was now an invitation I dearly wished I could rescind. When he reached my position on the bus, he stopped, turned away from me, and slowly, mechanically, sat in the empty space to my left. The two giants fore and aft were staring at him. The third was still quaking in some type of a spasm, but the one next to me never looked in my direction. He just sat, stock still, as if he had been turned off once again. The chills I had been experiencing intensified until I began to visibly shiver. Was it fear that brought on this response? I can't be sure. I can't be sure because I didn't know what I was afraid of. What I can be certain of, and this is where you will be inclined to put your page down and think I need not read any more of this lunatic's ramblings. But stick with me, I beg you. What I can be sure of is that I could feel this man within me. I am not talking about feeling his body heat, though the warmth radiating from his hulking carcass was considerable. I am talking about his mind, his soul, his aura, his anima creeping through me like an insect working its way up a pant leg, like a current of electricity searching for a ground, like a coursing pain that runs from head to toe. It was as much like any of these sensations as it was unlike them. It was, in every sense of the word, indescribable. I cursed my own vanity, for it was nothing more than the fear of embarrassment that kept me from screaming for help. Then, just when I thought I could take it no more, it stopped. I gasped in relief, and at the very same moment the Hulk rose to his feet and returned to where he had been standing. Mind you, this entire horrific event occurred to me and me only. No one else in the bus so much as dropped a newspaper in the interim of this violation that I had just endured. I sat stupefied in the aftermath of this experience, but now a new sensation overcame me, the distinct feeling of being watched. I turned to my right and found the source. The young girl with the dreads was looking at me, and I knew at once that she alone had noticed. I can only imagine that the look on my face was one of confusion. She was smiling as she slid in my direction and, with an outstretched finger, beckoned for my ear, to which I responded by leaning closer to her. I could feel her heat on my skin and the tickle of her breath in my ear as she spoke. In the next second, I was making for the door in a panic, yelling, "Stop the bus!" The bus driver hit the brakes and the crowd surged forward, save for the giants who didn't move at all. "Open the door," I cried when I reached the front of the bus. Then, for reasons I cannot fathom, I looked back to the riders and, as if on cue, all four giants snapped their heads in my direction, their eyes piercing into mine. The intensity of this moment propelled me backwards such that I lost my footing and fell headlong to the pavement, connecting skull with concrete in a sickening thud amid shocked expressions from the onlookers and riders, and despite the searing pain in my head, I struggled to my feet and sprinted down the street as fast as my legs would carry me. I did not stop running until I reached my home, where I promptly dispatched a tow truck to pick up my car at the Technical Institute and drop it off at Moe's Quick Repair. I informed Moe that I would pay any price to have it repaired by the end of the week. He must have taken this as a challenge, given what he charged me in the end, but any price was worth never having to board that bus again. It wasn't until later that evening that the full effect of the day's events were brought to bear on my soul. As I lay in bed that night, the ice pack on my head running cold fingers of water down my spine, I found myself fighting the aching need for sleep. As desperate as I was to achieve blissful unconsciousness, I couldn't bear the visions that accompanied the slumber. I could not go back to the scene of that bus and the hulking riders that surrounded me, but mostly I couldn't hear those words again, the haunting words carried on the whispers of that waifish child. "Don't worry," she whispered. "You're too small. We can't fit into you."